Well, it's a real pleasure to be back here again. I always enjoy talking here in Seattle because it's a receptive audience. It's just much more fun to talk with people who agree with you than those who disagree. But I should point out that not everybody is like-minded. And I sometimes even enjoy some people disagreeing with me. And in the middle of last week, I knew I had gotten under the skin of some people when the Wall Street Journal complained about my complaining about inequality. They thought there was too little inequality, and I thought there was too much. What I want to talk about today is my book, but it's really the book is about what I've been really passionate about for a long time, about the problem facing the United States, the great divide that has opened up. Dow explained some of the dimensions of it here in King County, but you should understand that you're better than most other parts of the country. The divide in most other parts of the country has gotten much more severe. As he mentioned, my interest was awakened when I was growing up in Gary, Indiana. I don't know if you know about Gary, Indiana. It's an industrial town in the southern shore of Lake Michigan that really traces out the history of industrialization and then deindustrialization in America. It was founded in 1906. It was a real company town. In fact, probably the most company town in the country. The name Gary, Indiana is named after the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. And it was the largest integrated steel mill at the time, and it's since gone into decline. But when I was there, what I saw was enormous amounts of inequality, extensive racial discrimination, and episodic unemployment. You know, my classmates' parents were out of jobs every 3 or 4 years as the economy went into a downturn. What I didn't realize was this was the golden age of capitalism. This was the best that it got. That's one of the themes I'm going to come back to, that one of the ideas that our understandings of economics that's changed a great deal was that back then, Simon Kuznets, who received a Nobel Prize, is the father of our national income account system, the way we measure GDP, that measures everything, as Robert Kennedy said, except what's important. But it was important for tracing out what was happening to the economy. And he enunciated what was called a Kuznets law. He didn't call it Kuznets law, but other people call it a Kuznets law. And the idea was that in the early stages of development, inequality would grow as some parts of the economy took advantage of new technology, new opportunities. And we saw that pattern in the United States, and we're seeing that pattern today in China. But then, as the parts that were lagging behind caught up, inequality would decline. The United States went through exactly that kind of pattern, and inequality had started to decline beginning in 1929, and it continued to decline. Actually, it continued to decline until about 1980. And so he was writing in the middle of the 50s, and he thought of this as a basic law of economics. Today, we know that's not true. Because we know that beginning around 1980, inequality in the United States and in many other countries has increased. And I'll come to in a moment to explain the alternative interpretation of what has gone on. But I wanted to tell a little bit about my own story. Having grown up in Gary, Indiana, I was motivated to try to understand what gave rise to this, what I thought was then high level of inequality. I didn't understand how bad it could get. And so when I went to, I went to Amherst College. I thought I was going to major in physics. Maybe something I could have amounted to something. But my passion, my concerns about trying to understand what was going on in inequality led me to MIT to study economics and to write my thesis under a great economist, Bob Solow, who himself had written his thesis on the distribution of income and inequality. I mention this because this was very counter to the main trend in economics. As you know, economists have had a lot of influence in our society, but the mainstream of economics has taken the view that even talking about inequality is a bad thing. Bob Lucas, who teaches at University of Chicago, got a Nobel Prize, said just a few years ago that the most vicious, the worst thing that any economist could do would be to talk about inequality. Sort of echoing the view that Mitt Romney did when he said one should only talk about inequality in closed rooms and quiet voices. You could understand why he might have said that. Well, out of my thesis, there was a paper published in Econometrica. I don't know how many of you read Econometrica regularly. I still modestly think it's an important paper. It's almost 50 years later, and it is still the basic paper laying out the foundations of the determinants of the distribution of income and wealth. But a few years ago, Vanity Fair asked me to write about the subject, and I wrote an article that really summarizes a lot of what is in this book. The title of the article was "Of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%. You sort of get the gist of what I was saying. Well, the good news was that article got a lot more readership than my Econometrica article did. In fact, it went viral, and that led the New York Times to ask me to curate a series in the New York Times on what we call the Great Divide. And some of those articles that I wrote are included in here as essays, updated and put in context of what has happened in the ensuing time. So what I want to do this evening very briefly is to talk a little bit about some of the new insights that we have into inequality, into the dimensions, the causes, the consequences, and what we can do about it. And I say, unfortunately, I only have a few minutes, and if you want to find out more about it, you'll have to buy the book or borrow it from somebody, because I don't want this to be a private property issue. So let me discuss a few ways in which our understanding of inequality has changed very dramatically. First, I mentioned before the dramatic change that happened around 1980 and the repeal of Kuznets' law. And there have been two interpretations of this. One is that World War II brought the country together. We had fought the war together. That resulted in a kind of national cohesion that it was a period where of our fastest economic growth, but it was a period of shared prosperity. Every group in the country grew, but those in the bottom grew faster than those at the top, so we converged. Now, just as statistics, many of you may not know this, but the top tax rate, the top marginal tax rate at the time was 91%. Now, if you listen to some people today, you would say at 91%, the economy must have been falling apart. No one was working. It just wasn't true. It was, as I say, the period of our greatest, fastest economic growth. Well, came the 70s. We went through a very difficult period in our country. There was the oil price shocks, Vietnam War, and it seemed for a while that our economic model wasn't working, and some people advocated trying another approach, and that was called supply-side economics. Those of us who studied economics thought this was a bonkers idea. But you could understand the sort of the logic. The logic was you lower tax rates, and that would provide more incentives. They lowered it down to 35%, a lot lower than the, actually below 35, almost down to 30%, a lot lower than the 91%. And you combine that with deregulation, taking away the constraints, and the two together was supposed to lead to a burst of economic growth. And yes, they realized that there would be more inequality, that doing this would lead the people in the middle and the bottom to get a smaller share of the economic pie. But the argument was the pie would get so much bigger that everybody would benefit, even those in the middle and the bottom. Well, we've now had a third of a century of this experiment, and we should be able to judge. And when we look at what's happened, part of the forecast was right. We did get more inequality. But that was the only part of the forecast that turned out correct. We grew more slowly, so much more slowly that in fact, in the middle, there has been essentially stagnation. Today, incomes are lower, adjusted for inflation, than they were 25 years ago, a quarter century ago. But this is an average of across different demographic groups. One demographic group that I have some empathy with is males. And the median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. So there's four decades of stagnation. But at the bottom, things are even worse. As most of you know, in the country as a whole, the minimum wage is lower, adjusted for inflation, than it was 45 years ago. And can you imagine a half century in which those at the bottom have seen no increase in their standard of living? A half century during which, actually over just the last 35 years, China has moved 500 million people out of poverty. The biggest change in a sense in a global era. And in the middle, incomes have increased eightfold. And in that era, that same period, we increased not only the numbers of people in poverty, the percentage of people in poverty. So if an economic system doesn't deliver for most of the citizens, something is wrong with the economic system. If we have an experiment that has failed that badly, we ought to think about maybe trying something else. So that was one of the hypotheses of what happened beginning in 1980 was that social cohesion after World War II began to erode after several decades. The other one is we tried a flawed experiment. I'll come back to these themes a little bit later. The second big idea that new understandings of inequality was, and Dow expressed this quite forcefully, it used to be thought that yes, inequality might be a bad thing, but if we were to do anything about it, we'd have to pay a high price. We'd have to give up on economic growth, economic performance in some important dimension. We now understand that the two are complements, not substitutes, that we can have more economic growth and less inequality. This used to be, people like me have argued this for a long time, but now this has actually become a mainstream view. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, not known as an exactly liberal organization, In fact, as many of you know, it represents the views, to a large extent, of financial markets. They have pointed out and have argued all over the world that inequality, especially when it achieves the level and the form that it does in the United States, is actually bad for economic growth. I wish, more government people, our political leaders, would listen to the IMF on this score. This is such a different view than Art Okun, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson, wrote a very famous book called The Big Trade-Off, where he talked about this trade-off. And today we realize that's no longer true. A third big idea relates to concepts, one of equality of income and outcomes on the one hand, and the other one of equality of opportunity. When the debate about inequality first began to heat up in the United States, there were some people like Representative Ryan, who said, we don't care about inequality of outcomes. The American way, Americans care about equality of opportunity. That's what's really important. Well, the fact is that not only does the United States have the highest level of inequality of income of any of the advanced countries, but it has among the lowest level of equality of opportunity. And that's so different from the way we see ourselves and the way others see us. What that means is that the life chances of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. So I tell my student, the most important decision that you have in your life is to choose the right parent. And if you make that decision wrong, the game is all over. And you see this in so many different ways. For instance, if you look at a child born in the top half who does poorly in school, he'll wind up with a higher income than somebody from the bottom half of our population who does well in school. It used to be said that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll get ahead. Not true in America. And what's so striking is it's much better in the other advanced countries, including the old Europe that we used to think of as being so class-ridden and so rigid. They've actually recognized their problems, and they've tried to change the way they've organized their society. And they've succeeded to a large extent. Not perfectly, but they've succeeded to a large extent. The fourth idea I want to emphasize, and that turns out to be really important, is that there is a huge variation in the levels of inequality across different countries in the world. And even in the direction of change. In some countries, inequality has actually been coming down. Now, why is that important? That's important because the economic forces at play are the same all over the world. They're global. Technology, globalization affect essentially all countries around the world, and particularly all advanced countries around the world. But the way these forces play out seem to be very different. And what that means, it's about our policies, about how we've shaped our economy and our society. And that in turn means it's about politics, and I'll come to that in a second. But let me try to illustrate some ways in which we shape our economy, we shape our society. If you have more monopoly power, then the monopolists can raise their prices. And if you have weaker protection of workers, weaker unions, then that bargaining power can drive down wages. People here in Seattle recognized that back in 1999, 98, when you had what is sometimes called the Seattle riots, the protests about WTO. And why would they protest? There were many issues. There was environment, there were concerns about developing countries, there were concerns about workers. But all of this was about how do we set the rules and regulations, legal frameworks which govern our economy. And that if globalization is an abstract force, but the way you shape globalization can lead to more inequality. Right now, the country is involved in a very big debate, or ought to be involved in a debate. The president tried to slide it through with nobody noticing, and that's about the Trade Promotion Authority and TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Partnership is a euphemism. There's one partner that's bigger than the others, and a transatlantic agreement. You know, those of us who believe in democracy think you ought to have an open debate about the issues. For some reason, the administration, in particular the USTR, doesn't believe that. So the negotiating positions of the US are not only kept secret, they're stamped secret. They've been made a national security secret. Now, it's not about national security. It's about bargaining positions. It's about the fact that corporate interests have a seat at the table. They get to see the U.S. bargaining position because they want to make sure that it is consistent with ways that will increase their profits. But NGOs, civil society, even congressmen have been having trouble getting a hold of it. Now, how can I be so adamant about that it's a bad agreement? Well, the great news about America is that everything leaks. Of course, the bad side of this is that NSA is listening to everything, including what I'm talking about now. So we know from the leaks, and the USTR and the president haven't denied anything about those leaks, that this trade agreement would, for instance, increase the power of big pharma, the drug companies, over generics. And the real irony of that is that Obama has made healthcare, Obamacare, the signature achievement of his administration. But these provisions in the trade agreement will drive drug prices up because it will weaken competition from generics. And Americans and people all over the rest of the world, the Pacific, are going to have to pay higher drug prices if this agreement goes through in the way that the U.S. government is negotiating. The way our economy functions has a lot to do, as I say, with the rules and regulations. Here in the Northwest, people value the environment, and the agreement has provisions that would make it very difficult to regulate to protect the environment. There's a particular provision that, called the investment agreement, which is particularly pernicious, because what it says is that if any country, including the United States, changes a law in ways that reduce the profits that a firm would have expected to have, the government has to compensate. And the trial doesn't occur in a public court. One of the basic aspects of our society is that judicial process is a basic part of government. But they privatize it. It goes to an expensive group of private lawyers who act as arbitrators. My concerns about this are not just hypothetical. We've seen these suits. And let me just share with you one example of something that's important, but it affects one aspect of inequality, health inequality, but there are many, many other aspects of inequality, including regulations about our financial system that we found out weren't so good. And you change those regulations, and again, you invite a suit. And let me tell you, countries are really, those who have already signed these kind of agreements are now worried about what will happen if they change their financial regulations. So this particular provision is, to me, a very interesting one. Back in the 19th century, there was a big trade imbalance between the West and China. China had a lot of goods that the West wanted. In particular, they had porcelain, China. But there are a lot of other things. Whereas the West did not have very many goods that China wanted. And there developed a big trade imbalance until Europe figured out a way of solving the problem. And that was a good that had a property that we in the business school at Columbia and all other business schools say is a great property, repeat purchases. And that, of course, was opium. One of the things about opium is once you buy it, you tend to buy it again and again and again. China figured out this wasn't so good, and they said, no thank you, we don't want any more of your opium. And the West said, you're interfering with a basic right of free trade. And not only did they say it, they went to war. They went to war twice, what are called the Opium Wars. And they won. They opened up the market, the first open market initiative to opium. And they also took away a lot of the concessions on the east coast of China. Well, you may not know this, but your government is waging the 21st century opium war. It's not opium this time, of course. It's a product that is addictive, made deliberately addictive. Again, good property for those who are interested in making money, repeat purchases, and destroys health. And that, of course, is cigarettes. Two countries, Uruguay and Australia, passed a law regulating cigarettes. Not a very strong law, very similar to the United States, where you said you had to label cigarettes as being hazardous to your health. They went one step further. They had pictures of lungs that were destroyed by the cigarettes. The problem was that these labels actually worked. And many people were discouraged from buying cigarettes. Philip Morris was not very happy. And they said, well, you're destroying our profits. The profits that we would have expected because we expected more people to buy our cigarettes until they died. And under a provision essentially identical to the provision that the president is insisting on having in the trade agreements, Philip Morris is suing Uruguay and Philip Morris. And if they win, Uruguay and Australia will have to either stop the labeling or compensate Philip Morris for this regulation. And the legal costs are enormous. In the case of Uruguay, a poor, South American country, it can't afford the legal costs. So fortunately, some well-off Americans, like Bloomberg and Gates, are paying for the cost of Uruguay defending itself. Now, can you imagine a situation where Americans have to pay to defend other countries against what our government has framed as a basic right of companies to be able to sell poisonous products? And this is just one example of many, many regulations that will be undermined, the trade agreement that the President Obama is pushing and trying to get a blank check that can be used not only by the current president, but the next president, whoever that is in 2016. And we don't know what the Congress is. We don't know what the next president is going to be. We hope we know, but we don't know. And he's asking for a blank check that will go on for years and years and years. Well, the point I want to make is laws and regulations shape our economy. And in shaping the economy, they shape the degree of inequality. And that's why the U.S. has more inequality than other countries. Now, it's not a question about what we can afford. Some people say, you know, we can't afford to take the actions that would lead us to have more equality. I think that's absolutely wrong. Just go back to the period that I mentioned before, the period right after World War II. We were then a much poorer country. That was 70 years ago. And in 70 years, we've grown. But at the end of World War II, what did we say? We said that everybody who had fought in the war, which was every able-bodied man and a lot of women, had the right to a free 4-year college education, to the best education that they could get into. If they got into Harvard, if they got into a community college, whatever they could get into, our nation paid for it. Today, when President Obama proposed that we have 2-year community colleges for our poorest Americans, many conservatives said we can't afford it. Now, is it a question that we can't afford it? No, it's obviously not a question. It's a matter of choice. And this is one of the real themes that I try to bring out in the book. The inequality that we have is a result of the choices that we've made. When I say we've made, our political system. And that brings me to the next point. When you have the level of inequality, economic inequality that we have, it almost inevitably translates into political inequality, to the point where we now have a system that's better described as $1 one vote than one person one vote. We have a kind of, and it gets even worse because as they get as the money influences our political system, just as it influences the rules of the economic game, it influences the rules of the political game. So we are the country where money talks the loudest in the political sphere. We are a country where corporate Citizens United corporations can give unlimited amounts of money for campaign contributions, where the last election, each candidate spent over $1 billion, and this election is expected to cost a lot more. And when corporations make what are called campaign contributions, these are not charity. They view these as investments. And when our banks made these investments were better than any of their financial investments. Those were a disaster. But their political investments really paid off, both in deregulation, in the bailouts, and then more recently in preventing the re-regulation that our country needed. Well, I've talked a lot about inequality at the top, talked a little bit about the growth of inequality at the bottom, the increase in poverty. But as the introduction to my talk pointed out, the real problem, a real problem in the United States is the evisceration of the middle. And he described how here in Seattle, which is one of the better performing places, all of the growth has been at the top and the bottom, but the middle class is shrinking. You know, that's reflected both in the fact that incomes in the middle, adjusted for the inflation, are stagnant for a quarter century. But it's also in that a smaller and smaller fraction of the population is plus or minus 50% of that middle income. And more people are moving into the bottom and the top tails. After World War II, the United States was successful in creating the first middle-class society. And the country was being brought increasingly together. But again, since 1980, and especially since the year 2000, the basic attributes, what defines a middle-class lifestyle, are increasingly being moved out of reach for a larger and larger number of Americans. Kind of retirement security, home ownership of the kind of home that they would like to have, sending their kids to college. All of these, you might say, almost basic necessities are becoming increasingly difficult. Take the issue of education, which is so important for getting ahead. What's happened here in Washington reflects what's happened in so many other places around the country. Cutbacks of support for universities and colleges have led to tuition soaring. The combination of soaring tuition and declining or stagnant incomes in the middle has meant the only way that you can get ahead is by borrowing. Student debt is now over $8 trillion, larger than credit card debt. It's affecting the way our economy functions in fundamental ways. Other countries have solved the problem in other ways. Australia has an income contingent loan program available for all the students, so they can borrow, but what they pay depends on their income. So if they decide to go into teaching high school, they know their income is going to be low, but the amount that they pay back adjusts commensurately. Whereas for so many young Americans, they feel their choices are constrained. They have to accept a job as a banker or a corporate lawyer when that's not really their passion, for good reason, and because it's the only way that they'll be able to pay back the crushing loans. The average student graduating from college now has $25,000 debt, but if you go on to graduate school, the numbers are more like $100,000, in some cases $200,000. Well, the final point I want to raise before I open it to question is that these problems that I've described won't be solved. There's no magic bullet. There's no, the problems have been growing for a third of a century. And so there's nothing that we can, there's no magic bullet, nothing we can do that will correct it right away. But if we don't begin, things will get worse and worse. We've seen the trajectory that our economy is on. An economy where we have growing and increasing inequality, where, for instance, 8 people who inherited their wealth have more wealth than the bottom 44% of the country, and exercise that wealth in the political sphere to try to make sure that they can, that others can't climb up. So it's really important for us now to recognize that minor tweaks in the system won't solve the problem. It is really important to increase the minimum wage. It is really important to increase educational opportunities. But unless we address some of the more fundamental structural problems that have led us to be the economy with the most inequality, we're just addressing the symptomatic problems. We aren't getting at the root causes. So that's why I think it's just imperative that we begin to discuss what are the root causes and figure out what to do about it. But I also think that we can't wait to solve the problem that, as I say, is going to take literally to correct the mistake that's been accumulating for a third of a century. It will take another 20, 30 years. In the meanwhile, I think we have to take actions to make sure that a middle-class lifestyle is accessible to the majority of our citizens. So I just want to end on this note of urgency. 35 years ago, we began this grand experiment, which anybody with an inkling of a scientific background would say has been a dismal failure. We have to change. And we can't go on as business as usual. I hope discussions like this, town hall meetings all over the country, will be part of a process of bringing about that kind of change, that we will take this course, not of accepting business as usual, continuing the course we've been on for a third of a century, but really going into the different course that will enable us to restore the kind of society that we had, the kind of social cohesion that we had in the decades after World War II. Thank you.
So we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A now. I'd like to remind folks that we've got mics on either side of the stage. If you could please come up here to ask your question. And because there are quite a few people looking to ask their questions, I'd like to ask everyone to keep your questions brief and in the form of a question. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is something contrary, but science and history demonstrate that power laws reflect the natural distribution of inequality in nature across cultures, economic systems, and human endeavor. Moreover, discussions regarding inequality frequently occur with an underappreciation of these natural laws and economics' deeper biological origins. I was just getting there. How can we reliably discriminate nature's deeper power-related laws regarding the natural social physics of inequality from other objective contributions and that which is exploited for political ends?
Well, I'm not sure what the question was, but the point I wanted to make is that the fact is that the degree of inequality differs across countries. So these are not natural laws. That the fact, we're not every society has some inequality. We're not talking about eliminating inequality, but the magnitude of the inequality is greater than, and significantly greater than in other countries. And inequality in the United States has been increasing, in other countries has been decreasing. So again, these are not natural laws. They are the result of the policies and our politics. And in that, there's a lot of hope because it means we can change it.
How important do you believe that unions are and continue to be towards maintaining the middle class? In this state, we have a very worrisome problem. There is a big movement to turn the state into a right-to-work state. What suggestions, what help do you think?
I think that would be a big mistake. And unions have played an important role in, as part of, you might say, our systems of checks and balances. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about was the issues of corporate governance and the power of executives. One of the really, truly outstanding facts of inequality in the United States is the growth of CEO pay relative to those of average citizens. Used to be 20 to 1, now is closer to 301, and that increase is not because they suddenly got more productive. The bank CEOs got huge bonuses, not because, and even after 2008, when they brought the banks and our country to the brink of ruin, they walked off with huge bonuses. So what we have come to understand is that it's not just competitive forces in the way that you learned about that in your elementary textbooks that are driving the inequality in the United States, but it's you might say a balance of power. And right now we have an imbalance. And really the voice of workers is not being adequately heard. And it's not heard in lots of different forms. I mean, for instance, one of the issues is the Federal Reserve. Monetary policy supposed to affect output, inflation, and unemployment. That's supposed to be the mandate to look after all three of those. But there's nobody representing workers. A lot of people representing the banks in the financial sector. And so you get an imbalance between a concern about inflation and a concern about unemployment. Some other countries that are much better performing have always a representative from workers on the Federal Reserve, on their equivalent of the central bank, the Federal Reserve Board. So unions are the way that workers get together in some sense and try to reflect the interests and concerns of workers. You know, there are imperfections in unions, just like there are imperfections in corporations. I mean, no human institution is perfect. So, you know, we know that there were lots of problems in the past. Unfortunately, the union's strength has been diminished to the point where it's about 10% of the labor force. Again, some people said that this is the natural evolution. It's not true. Other countries that have experienced just as much globalization, just as much technology, have a much greater voice of workers, and one of the reasons why they have more equality. So it's the way we shape our economy and our society.
Yes, I'd like to know your, there was a book that came out over a year ago by Thomas Piketty, and I'm wondering what you thought of what he wrote about in that book compared to your thoughts about inequality. One of the things he mentioned, I'd never read it, but I wish I had. But one of the things he brought up was that from the progressive era until about 1980, that it was our economic results were mostly an anomaly, and that what we're doing is returning to what maybe we naturally are when we were in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah, so I actually did talk about that in my book very explicitly. A couple of the essays were, in some sense, written in response to Piketty. He tries to argue, the title of his book is Capital in the 21st Century, and the main thesis is precisely what you said, that inequality is basically the natural workings of the capitalist system, and it's the accumulation of capital that's driving this inequality. And the real anomaly was what I call the golden age of capitalism of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I argue that he's wrong, that it's not about capital in the 21st century, it's about democracy in the 21st century. And that it's the way we shape the economic system, and that we can have a market economy, let me say a market economy, where markets actually work like markets are supposed to, where you have less market power on the part of monopolies, where you don't have the CEOs having the kind of say over the division of the corporate pie that they have. A whole set of deviations from textbook economics that have driven inequality to the extent that it is. So my view is he's right in documenting the magnitude of inequality, but the interpretation of that, I think he's wrong. That I'm much more hopeful that we can do something about it if we can get our politics right.
It's an honor to be able to ask you a question. I note that this is another book question. David Stockman wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Great Deformation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but he's on the opposite end of the political spectrum from you, yet he has many of the exact same concerns. He decries supply-side economics, he decries the concentration of wealth in the top 1% and the amount of power that they have accrued and so forth and so on. It's interesting to me that two people in completely different parts of the political spectrum would have extremely or quite similar concerns, and I was interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, there are actually now today a lot of issues on which there is a broad consensus, both on the right and the left, with corporate interests in the middle taking a different view. Let me give you another example. I thought we needed to have a much deeper reform of our banking system after the crisis of 2008. One of the problems are too big to fail banks. Those too big to fail banks are also too powerful. They're too politically powerful. Interesting thing, I've been testified at Congress. I was on a panel with people on the left and the right, people who've been head of actually one of the regional Federal Reserve banks, a very conservative person, and a professor at Stanford. All of us on the panel, except for one person, agreed that we had a real problem with too big to fail banks, and the one person who disagreed was the banker. So I think that's an example where there's a broad consensus. There are a lot of other areas, particularly where monopoly power, people who believe in competitive markets don't like monopoly power, and that could be on the right or the left. So there is actually a lot of consensus. One more area is the governance of the Federal Reserve. It's supposed to be a public institution, and yet the regional presidents who vote on where the interest rate is going to be that drives how our economy performs, those are really not even approved by Congress. They're a cabal of people. You probably don't even know how they're done. I don't think anybody knows. But they're mostly people from the banking community, sometimes a little bit of a bank from the business community, almost no representatives from workers, even though they're so badly affected by it.
Thank you, Professor.
Hi. I've helped to organize a community forum here in Seattle for next month, May 30th, to talk about this issue, inequality, both locally here in King County and nationally. And the goal of our forum is not only to talk about the here's what's happening, the here's what, and then the so what, how it really impacts us, which you've talked a lot about tonight, but then to get into a conversation about the now what. What do we as local citizens, community members do about it? How do we get involved? If you were to show up at our forum, how would you counsel us to get more involved, and what specific actions would you advise us to take so we can make a difference?
Well, first, I begin by saying, the economic framework is the most important determinant of inequality. So, and it's every aspect. It's the laws and regulations. It's the tax system that rewards, for instance, speculation more than it rewards hard work. And they talk about incentives, but having lower taxes on the speculation on land, has anybody ever shown that leads to more land? I've still been waiting for the supply side response on this, and a little bit of landfill, but it's not a very big deal. And education. A lot of discussion finally going on about what happens before children enter the kindergarten. That a lot of the problems start basically even prenatal, and that we have to deal with that. So those overall frameworks are really important, but at the local level, there's still a lot that can be done, because a lot of the inequality is in some sense local in nature. Now, one of the reasons I was happy to come to Seattle is because you started here in Seattle a national movement for raising the minimum wage. And this is an example where citizen, participation at the local level has had a national influence. Mayor de Blasio on Wednesday announced an agenda, I think motivated him to some extent by what you've done, announcing that a commitment to reduce poverty in New York City by 800,000. And a key part of that was increasing the minimum wage. So that local activity is important. A second aspect of this, housing. If we're going to have communities that are diverse, we have to have affordable housing. If we want to live in economically segregated, of course we don't. The striking thing, I didn't mention this, but one of the reasons why the United States is becoming a country with less and less inequality, less and less equality of opportunity, is that we've become a country with more and more economic segregation. That rich people live with rich people, poor people live with poor people, and that's really destroying the sense of community that we have. So housing, zoning, is a really responsibility at the local level. Public transit is a local issue. And if you can't get to a job, you can't get a job. And particularly, you know, poor people, unfortunately, one of the problems about being poor is that you don't have any money. And that means that if you try to buy a car, you tend to buy a poor car. And what is the problem with poor car? Those students all know about this. They break down all the time. And then you don't have the money to repair them. And then you don't show up to work, and your boss gets mad and he fires you. And it's a vicious circle. You need good public transportation systems. So there are a lot of things that you can do at the local level, I think. But the most important thing, I think, I think you have to do both of these. Try to change what goes on at the local level, create more equality at the local level, but you have to agitate for the rules and regulations at the national level.
Okay, I'm convinced you can come to our meeting.
You offered two explanations for what happened in 1980. One was the loss of the social cohesion, the second, this failed economic theory. You've partially answered my question, which is, isn't there a third alternative suggested by Piketty's, the shift of power to capital in the Trente Glorieuses, and by Yanis Varoufakis's shift in the deficit surplus from the beginning of the end of the global plan and the beginning of the global Minotaur age. Isn't it rather this third possibility is that a shift of power to capital took place, and that power was able to implement the policies that have produced the inequality, and we didn't have a successful Soviet Union to scare the capitalists as FDR did in the 30s. So isn't it really a lack of a viable socialist alternative that is the problem here?
Well, I think it is the framework that has been failed to be able to check the development of the power, you might say, of the 1%. And I use that as a metaphor because a lot of people in the 1% are actually worried about what has been happening to our society. And what I've been trying to describe is how changes in the rules and regulations have affected this change in the market power of monopoly, the weakening of unions. I tell in the beginning of my book an interesting story that reflects what happens when you don't have the check of real competition across economic systems. And I think that point that you make there is relevant. I was at a dinner party of somebody, in New York, we divided between the east side, west side, between east of Central Park and west of Central Park. And it's a little bit of a caricature, but it's still true that they're different cultures. And the east side, for those of you who don't know, is where the bankers live. And the west side is where the publishers and the musicians and Columbia University is. So, but I do get invited across the park occasionally, and I got invited across the park by somebody very wealthy who was very concerned about the growth of inequality, and she decided to have a dinner party. and decided to invite a few academics and a number of billionaires, multi-billionaires. It was an interesting evening, marked by kinds of conversation that were really memorable. As one of the people who had inherited a few $1 billion was saying, how about lazy people, and then. And then he went on, people who shirked, and then he went on and talked about, with the guy sitting next to him, about where is the best place to hide your money. Was the Cayman Islands better than some other offshore center? But then the conversation went on to a refrain that got heard several times in the evening, which was, remember the guillotine. Which was a refrain back, of course, for those of you who know, back to the French Revolution. And what was so interesting, it wasn't a sense of compassion that was motivating the discussion, except for themselves, I think. It wasn't a sense of what is a just society. It was, we have to remember not to be too greedy because we aren't very many. And there are limits of how much of the pie that we can take for ourselves. And so, in a sense, that is part of one of the things, and I saw that in the context of development, of the way we treated countries in Africa and elsewhere. When there was competition, we treated them a lot better than when the era of competition ended. And I think there's an important lesson from that.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Well, thanks. Does the term fascism, defined by Mussolini as the marriage of corporation and state, resonate with you? Especially regarding policies and Supreme Court decisions and data-driven police states? Okay.
Well, fortunately, we're not down that far.
Are you sure?
I better take the last question.
Hi, I'm Blythe. We are so grateful that you've come here, and I represent a group of PhD students from the University of Washington studying pharmacoeconomics, and together we have a question for you. So we absolutely love your 1973 paper with Rothschild establishing the pooled and separated equilibrium for health insurance. And so what we wanted to know is just wait, you guys, it's important. How do you predict, what do you predict is going to be the effect of the Affordable Care Act, of Obamacare, in changing inequality based off of this equilibrium?
Okay, well, I think the affordable, the distinguishing aspect of America is that it has been the only advanced country that has not recognized the right to access to health care as a basic human right. And it shows up, the fact that we don't recognize it shows up in the statistics that in terms of average life expectancy, we do much more poorly than countries that spend a lot less money. That we spend about 17% of GDP. There are countries like Australia that spend 8% of GDP, but their life expectancy is 3 years longer than the United States. But you look within the United States at the life expectancy of people who are at the bottom. Even something broad like those women who have not graduated from high school. And it's 10 years shorter than those who managed to graduate from college or from the rest of the average Americans. I have to tell a little story. I was President Sarkozy of France visited Colombia in the midst of the Affordable Care Act debate. Obamacare debate, and a student asked him, "What do you think of Obamacare? Of the bill?" And he first hesitated, and he says, I don't want to comment on your domestic disputes. Remember, Sarkozy is on the right in France. Just went. And then he couldn't help himself, but he went on to say, "I just don't understand you Americans. We on the right in France view access to health care as a basic right. We can't imagine the way that you've approached health care." Now, I think there are two aspects of Obamacare. One of them was that it would extend access. It's been undermined by the fact that a large number of states, including the states that have been where the need is greatest, have turned down Medicaid expansion. And so they've totally undermined, and the Supreme Court said that undermined the mechanism that was put into the law to try to cajole states to providing health care for their poor citizens. So that part, just was undermined by the Supreme Court, and so there won't be equal access in the southern states in the United States. The second thing was that it was intended to bring down cost. I think it will do that to some extent, but in getting that agreement, Obama made some compromises that allowed monopoly power to continue in the health insurance industry. It allowed monopoly power to continue in the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the reasons why Americans pay much higher drug prices than others, anywhere else in the world. And as I said earlier, I am very worried and am befuddled why Obama is trying to push a trade agreement which will lead to higher drug prices for Americans and for countries all over other members of the trade agreement. Now, over the long run, what she was asking about is my earlier work raised some real problems of what are called adverse selection, of problems that when you're an insurance company, the best way of increasing your profits is to make sure that you don't insure people who are going to need the insurance. And they spend a lot of money to figure out how to do that, and they're very clever. And the implication of that is I am not, over the long run, optimistic that this kind of patchwork that we did to try to keep an old system going rather than reforming it to a single-payer system, recognizing recognizing that that system is broken. And I mentioned before that, how much evidence do you need? The experimenting supply-side economics, 35 years old, has been a failure. Our system of private health insurance has been going on longer, and it's a more dismal failure. So I think eventually we will have to force to think about alternatives, and there are alternatives that are working so much better than ours.
Thank you so much.